Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know New Englanders found justification for the Salem witchcraft trials in the Bible? During these trials, many people were convicted based off of the idea of spectral evidence, which is evidence using ghosts or apparitions. One man refused to enter a plea, and he was actually pressed to death, lying stones on top of him till it crushed his body. And out of all the young women who accused those of Salem and surrounding villages of being witches and wizards, only one accuser acknowledged or apologized for her role in these trials. It was Ann Putnam, who accused 62 different people and apologized 13 years later. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because we'll learn about that and more in this episode. Episode 17, Extra Credit, Something Brewing in Salem. Double Double, Toil and Trouble, Fire Burn, and Cauldron Bubble. Hello and welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. My name is Christopher Caldwell and I'm joined once again by my fellow history nerds, Bill Gorman and Zach Wood. Well, thanks again for joining me, and today we're talking about something that I have always found so fascinating, and that is the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 and 93, and certainly one of the iconic events in early American colonial history. I think really when we talk about this, and we'll go into detail about all kinds of aspects of it, but what we need to really think about, and the question that will get us talking more than any other, is how did this small town of Salem, Massachusetts in the late 17th century get so wrapped up in witchcraft? Over 100 people were sent to prison. Eventually, Salem did rename itself Danvers in order to separate itself from the witchcraft trials, which was a good move. And this ended up going down as one of the most embarrassing events in American history. So I think it's important that we take a step back and examine the role of the church in the late 1600s in the colonies. We've talked about the role of the church in the early 1600s with the founding of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, but now that we're into the late 1600s, I think it's important to touch on it once again. So the failure of the English Revolution and the restoration of the crown in 1660 saw colonists who were motivated to create a Calvinist-centric congregation in New England. We talked about this in the episode on the Puritans and Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, that these Calvinists believed in predestination, and this is something that's important to keep in mind when considering the events in Salem. So in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1690s, the people of Salem believed that your average person had the ability to harness the goodness of God in what they did, but also the evil power of the devil. And those that harnessed the evil power of the devil, or who were being influenced by the devil or had a covenant with the devil, were considered wizards if they were men or witches if they were women. Now, this wasn't just unique to Salem. Dozens of people were hanged throughout the 17th century in Massachusetts and present-day Connecticut. So once again, this overarching question of why did this happen in Salem in the late 17th century?
So, Chris, a few mechanics of witchcraft and how these Calvinist colonists conceived of witchcraft. It'd be useful to go into that right now. So the Calvinists believed that everyone had specters, and the best way that we can understand that today would be ghosts. So, Chris, you have your worldly form, your body over there, but you also have a specter. Same thing with you, Bill. You have a specter, and I could maybe see your specter if I was out walking one night or something like that. And these specters can be influenced by God, devil, the Holy Spirit, demons, angels, whatever. A witch would be someone who can afflict someone with either pain or strange speech or shakes. And if this were to occur, someone would often say that they had been attacked by so-and-so's specter. So if I woke up one morning, Chris, and I was, maybe having a seizure or shakes, uncontrollable shakes, I would then say, "Oh, Chris's specter attacked me in the night, and now I have these shakes." Or you could say, "I saw Bill. I saw your specter consorting with the devil," and this theological view had existed for a long time. So at Salem, at this point, when prior to the trials occurring, witchcraft is very commonplace, right? They would have all known of a gentleman by the name of Cotton Mather, who wrote a book in Boston regarding the Goodwin children and their affliction and how they had been afflicted by witchcraft. And Mather is a very respected person in the colony. He's very well educated. So the fact that he's, a learned man of great reverence talking about this, everyone would, believe, oh, yes, witches, of course.
And he wrote this very shortly before the witchcraft hysteria, too. So this would have been very well known to the people of Salem.
Correct.
Yes. When we talk about the fear of witches and the willingness of the society to kill these witches, it really all goes back to Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. This is where the justification comes from, and this has the quote, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So the idea being, straight from the Bible, if you're proven to be a witch, you're to die. Most of the people in these Salem witchcraft trials who were convicted and executed were not burned. And often when we think of witches and execution, you think of burning them at the stake. But it is important to remember that these people were mostly hanged. All but one were hanged. Now, Mather talked about Goody Glover and the trials in which 4 children were put under her spell, and she was put to death. In 1648, in Charlestown, was actually the first witch trial in which Margaret Jones was said to have had a teat, and she was hung in 1648 for being a witch because of this teat. So it wasn't just in Salem, but these witch trials had existed in Massachusetts for a couple generations leading up to the witchcraft hysteria in Salem. Now, misogyny, as we'll sort of cover, and as we talk more about the details, you'll likely be able to see, misogyny was pretty apparent throughout all of these trials. But I think the most important, misguided belief in Salem at this time is that perception was reality. And this is what's so powerful about these witchcraft trials, because if perception is reality, then how do you ever prove any type of innocence?
Yes, Chris. I mean, you mentioned that the puritanical society is patriarchal, and right, these men are in power, yet they get entranced by the testimony of young girls. So basically, based on just nothing but the testimony, or what we would consider, tall tales or hearsay, these people who have almost no status in the society, these young girls, end up driving these trials to the death of many people in Salem. It's really fascinating how this patriarchal group attaches to them.
Yeah, and I was about to say, that's another aspect of these trials that just doesn't really seem to make sense when you look at it on paper. And the trials, look, we have hundreds of documents on the trials, but unfortunately historians don't have verbatim transcripts. So we don't know during these trials exactly what was said, but we've been able to piece together a lot of it. There were likely over 150 accusations of witches. So this was a widespread accusations. But let's backtrack a little bit and talk about where it all began, because I think, talking about the beginning of the event and how it all unfolded is the best way to really understand what direction we're going to be going here. And it all began with Reverend Parris in the winter of 1691 and 1692. All right, shouldn't say it all begins with the Reverend, but it all begins with his family at his house. So the Parrises had a caretaker, a slave named Tituba, and Elizabeth Parris and her cousin Abigail Williams were in care of Tituba. And Tituba was from the Caribbean or maybe Africa or India. No one's totally sure where she was from, but she definitely was not from. She was foreign in some way. The girls claimed that she was doing some type of voodoo. Some historians will argue that she was trying to come up with ways in which to identify the witches, while other historians will take the totally opposite approach and claim that she was the original witch. So, I guess it's up to you to decide what you believe. But she begins to say things in private to these girls that make them suspicious. She's suspending egg whites in water, and she's looking into this, and she's predicting who their future husbands will be. And while today this would just be, typical things that girls do, I guess, I don't know. I would assume they do things like this. But back then, this was really scandalous, especially because Tituba was an adult and she was an outsider, right? And the fear of other will definitely come into play. Over time, this group will grow to about 8 girls with ages of about 12 to 20, and they begin to act strange. They had fits. They were caught up in uncontrollable trances. They would hurt themselves. They scream and yell during gospel readings, refuse to listen to the reverend, refuse to participate in church services at all. And so Reverend Parris, trying to get to the bottom of this, called in a physician. And we have to remember that physicians in the late 17th century weren't quite the quality of physicians that we have today. Unsurprisingly, the physician is unable to figure out what's wrong with them. And he determined that they're either witches or they're being controlled by witches. Either way, the devil's work was very apparent to this doctor. And we have to remember, these are young girls. The fear is that the witches could turn other young girls into witches. So the fear here is that these girls that were being controlled in some way could have eventually turned into witches if something wasn't done. So this incites additional fear in the spread of witchcraft in this area. And this fear is the primary cause for the hysteria in the first place. It all stems out of fear. And what happens is the girls point their finger at Tituba, which is the beginning of all of this witchcraft hysteria. And there are going to be 3 women who are initially accused of witchcraft. Tituba, Sarah Good, who's a town beggar, and Sarah Osborne, who's old and bedridden. She had married an indentured servant, and she had not been attending church as often. And they were accused with Tituba. And of course, all 3 of these women have something in common. There's weakness in their church attendance. There is a lower status, socioeconomic status, and more importantly, a lower status within the church for all 3 of these women. And of course, in Tituba, she is the most likely target because of this just innate fear of other, right? She's so much different than most people in Salem at this time. So they're all brought into court of Oyer and Terminer. And keep in mind, the court of Oyer and Terminer wasn't a permanent court. These weren't judges, your typical magistrates. This was the political leadership who created an ad hoc court just out of thin air because of this hysteria. So these judges don't have much knowledge, if any, of true sense of jurisprudence, and this will certainly come to show. These women are tried, I put in quotes, because if we find out this trial was a bit of a farce of a trial, but these women are tried, and they all deny it at first. Eventually, Tituba gave in and admitted her role in the conspiracy, telling the people that a tall man with a black outfit came to her with a book and made her sign the book. And this book had a list of other witches, including Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Tituba said, quote, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." And her testimony went on for 3 days. And the most critical part of her testimony is she said there were 9 total women. So by admitting to her role in this, and saying that there were 6 other women that had not been found out, she's going to greatly incite fear throughout the community, and this will begin the true witch hunt, in which many women and some men were arrested, and this eventually spread to other towns throughout Massachusetts. So my question is, Bill, what happened to all of these women who were rounded up in Salem, and what exactly was the process for them after they had been accused?
You know, with all of these women starting to be rounded up, imprisoned, etc., you have to eventually do something with them. So we have the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, I would say trial is a generous word to use around these proceedings. So let's first talk about the process. Douglas Linder, law professor at UMKC, outlined 7 basic steps. That is the procedure used during these trials. So let's run through those quickly. First, the afflicted person makes a complaint to the magistrate about a suspected witch. The complaint is sometimes made through a third person. Second, the magistrate issues a warrant for the arrest of the accused person. Third, the accused person is taken into custody and examined by 2 or more magistrates. If, after listening to testimony, the magistrate believes that the accused person is probably guilty, the accused is sent to jail for possible re-examination and to await trial. So let's pause, because it's important to note that after listing off number 3, there is nothing in there about the accused having any right to representation. We will, of course, get into that later. Number 4, the case is presented to the grand jury. Depositions relating to the guilt or innocence of the accused are entered into evidence. Let's pause again. Evidence is also an interesting facet to this trial extravaganza. As Zach briefly mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about ghosts, specters, and that's going to be evidence here. Number 5, if the accused is indicted by the grand jury, he or she is tried before the court of Oyer and Terminer. A jury, instructed by the court, decides the defendant's guilt. So we do have a trial by jury here. Number 6, the convicted defendant receives his or her sentence from the court. In each case at Salem, the convicted defendant was sentenced to be hanged on a specified date. And finally, number 7, the sheriff and his deputies were charged with carrying out the sentence of death on that specified date.
So what's interesting is how bureaucratic this is, given that we're dealing with spiritual matters. They really build up a strong legalistic bureaucracy, even though essentially it's all theological, it's all spiritual.
Yeah, and they have a process for doing all of this, but and we'll talk more about spectral evidence, but once you bring in evidence that can't be proven or disproven, it all falls apart. For me, and of course not being able to defend yourself is probably the most critical weakness in all of this. But we have to keep in mind, all of this is motivated by fear. Everyone is looking through this situation through the lens of their own self-interest. So if you are a threat to me, I am going to be more likely to convict you or support a conviction if it means I'm going to be safer in everyday life. Of course, the issue we get into is when people start thinking like that, then the snowball gets rolling downhill, and then maybe you're the next one to be accused, and everyone else will look at your accusation in the same lens, and you become the victim. And when I teach this in my class, I always pick out a student and I say, Andrew, you're guilty of cheating on the last test. What do you say? And he just says, they always say, no, I'm not. And I always tell them, well, that's exactly what a witch or wizard would say. So that's how I know that you were guilty, because a guilty person would deny it, right? And what they begin to realize is that this trial is based off of testimony. The only way out of it in any way is to confess. There's no way to prove your innocence. And if you confess, then maybe you have a chance of not getting hanged, which is why we have so many people in the Salem witchcraft trials confessing to something that they likely did not do.
That's what makes this all so maddening and frustrating, Chris. I mean, Tituba confesses and she doesn't get executed to witchcraft. So, then you go, well, why aren't people confessing? Well, they're good, devout Puritan Calvinists. So if someone says, you're a witch, and you go, no, I'm not. I'm a member of the elect. I know my commandments. I read my Bible. I'm a good person. And as you said, that's exactly what a witch would say. But if you personally are devout, you can't confess to witchcraft because that means you're not, right, get a member of the elect and won't be saved. What are you to do?
And that's a good point, Zach. And I really want to reinforce that this goes back to that Calvinist idea of predestination, right? And how much they thought about the afterlife and their salvation. If they deny it, they have a very good chance of dying, right? But if they confess, they're basically giving away any opportunity of salvation. So it is a critically difficult decision for them to make with regards to their, current life on earth and comparing that in importance to their spiritual salvation, which is a situation that I certainly am not enviable of. That sounds like a truly awful predicament to be in.
So if we use your student example, Chris, it's like, I know you cheated on the last test. And they go, well, no, I didn't. And you go, okay, well, you're either going to be kicked out of school forever unless you confess. And if you do confess and you're guilty of this, you're going to fail and we're not going to send you to the next grade. So you're completely trapped, right? You can say, I didn't do it, and then they're going to expel you because they said you did. Or you could confess and now you can't advance. So what are you to do?
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but now you have this scarlet letter, so to speak, of a cheater. Mm-hmm. And in this case, they have this scarlet letter of being a witch. And this is something that where reputation and social status is so critically important. If you have this scarlet letter of being a witch, that's something you can never get rid of and something that will continue to follow your family members with them, for generations. And so really you're doing a disservice to your family, at least in the minds of those people. They're doing a disservice to their family by admitting to this also.
I think a large part of why all of this seems so unusual to us, it's not just because we're talking about ghosts, right? It's also because we have to remember that we're in 1692 colonial America. The laws, rights, privileges that we know today about how criminal proceedings are supposed to operate don't really apply right now. We're mostly talking about custom, some colonial charters, a little bit about English common law. But I took evidence in law school. I happened to crush the evidence question on the bar examination for
congratulations, Bill.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
We're really proud of you.
Nothing like living in the past.
Absolutely. As long as you don't start talking about your high school athletic career, then we're okay.
But I gotta tell you, I don't remember a whole lot about spectral evidence coming up in my evidence class or on the bar exam, and I think there are clear reasons for that. Obviously, I'm not throwing around any legal opinions on this podcast, but the term spectral evidence should be discussed.
So real quick, clear it up for the listener who doesn't. We've mentioned spectral evidence 4 or 5 times now. What exactly is spectral evidence?
Basic definition of spectral evidence: it is when an accuser says the specter of the accused had harmed them on instruction from the devil.
The specter being like a ghost or a
correct,
spirit.
Ghosts. We're talking about ghosts. Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So as you can see, airtight evidence, just foolproof.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
But you laugh, but this spectral evidence was relied upon in these trials, and there's a particular reason why that was. To be found guilty of witchcraft, the court needed to establish that the accused made a covenant with the devil. How do you demonstrate that? Well, if you have accusers that are saying they are operating in tandem with the specter of the devil, then you can draw that link.
So without a confession, right? The only way to prove someone's a witch or a wizard is this spectral evidence. And that's why, I mean, it seems to me that's why it had to be allowed.
Yeah, and I think it also should be pointed out. You say, proving it, but there is no, to my knowledge, standard of proof being applied here. I mean, so we're talking of a very loosely constructed evidentiary proceedings here.
Yeah, and I think you have to consider, right? These judges, remember, they're leaders of the community, political leaders of the community, not your typical judges. And when we talk about political or social leaders, their job is to look out for the betterment of the community. So you have this overwhelming fear sweeping through your community. It is then, I'm sure they felt the responsibility of quelling that fear. What do we do to take care of this problem? And if they don't allow spectral evidence in, then they really have no way of convicting those that are accused and making everyone feel much safer. Obviously, this ends up opening up Pandora's box and it got totally out of control, but you can at least understand why they wanted to entertain the idea of spectral evidence, because they likely felt the responsibility of finding a conclusion to this hysteria.
Absolutely, Chris. I think it is incredibly apparent that the body of the magistrates, those people who comprise the judges and magistrates of these trials, didn't have the extensive legal backgrounds that we would think judges would, especially compared to today. So you have these judges and magistrates that were listening to these young girls saying they were pinched and harmed in certain ways by these specters, ghosts, and they took it at face value. At no point in time in any of the record that still exists did any of the judges or magistrates actually stop and asked, were you actually harmed? It was just a given. And that is, it is just bizarre to me, as we look through a modern lens. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and that's something to think about, right? The modern versus what was going on in the 17th century. So you have to think these people, they're looking for explanations, right? They live very close to the frontier. There's these native peoples on the borders. There's this backdrop of a coming Indian war, and you can see how looking for an explanation would lead someone to the supernatural, especially given how important religion is in their lives.
I just wanted to take a step away from the discussion real quick and thank you all for joining us today. If you're enjoying the episode so far today, please leave a review wherever you access the podcast and give Zach or Bill a shout out for all the work they contribute to the podcast too. It is much appreciated. All right, let's get back to the discussion.
I did want to quickly address, because it's worth mentioning, even though we've been spending now a decent chunk of time on spectral evidence, which I think we can all conclude is rather silly, there were another couple of tests that they ran on the accused, which they called folklore tests.
Well, I'm sure these are foolproof.
I think they are rock solid. They are just smoking gun level evidence. The first, the touching test. A witch, if by touching could cure an afflicted person, would be a witch. I think that's what they might call circular logic. Second, witches' marks. So a jury of midwives examines the accused for strange or unusual marks. If there are, a teat would be an example. The accused would in fact be a witch. I don't think we would ever believe these spectral claims today. But instead, the accusers banded together and organized synchronized moments to really drum up support, or at least belief, in their claims. So now you might say, if we saw someone in court today that was claiming they were seeing a specter and that specter was harming them, that we would say you may need a psych evaluation or something of that nature, or we would say you may need to get professional help. Instead, when these accusers banded together and they orchestrated these elaborate synchronized moments of spectral evidence occurring, this collective reinforcement was critical to judges and magistrates continuing to fan the flames of the trials themselves. So, I mean, we clearly have some misguided people, and Zach will talk a little bit more about, why that was, but either way, wittingly or unwittingly, they were condemning people to death.
I know one thing Zach had mentioned before in our discussions is their proximity to the frontier, right? And how a lot of the people who were accusing were the ones on the outskirts of the village. And with a Native American conflict upcoming, King Philip's War, you can understand how there are very high tensions at this time. And they're looking for some type of explanation. And unfortunately, they end up going to the supernatural.
Just to play devil's advocate, no pun intended.
Nice. Oh, very, very good. How long have you been holding on to that one?
A long time, since the topic.
Yeah.
There are a few pieces of evidence to indicate that spectral evidence in and of itself wasn't the determining factor in sentencing these people to death. There are some legal scholars out there who claim this. I tend to believe that's a bunch of malarkey, if I can say that on this podcast.
Yeah, watch your language there, Bill.
We should note, here's the background. The custom of the time was that witchcraft was real. Covenants with the devil were real. So this was the stuff that people assumed could happen and are claiming did happen.
So, these beliefs lay the groundwork for all of this. But like I mentioned earlier, eventually things spiral out of control. Now, down the line, they'll rein it all in. But, that is what provides all of this to take off.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
For lack of a better phrase.
The witchcraft trials, started to drag on and on for months. And I think folks in the community started to wise up a little bit and say, geez, guys, things are getting a little violent here. And Zach mentioned earlier, he referenced a Mather. Well, we have another Mather who actually writes a piece titled Cases of Conscience.
And this is Increase Mather. So this is Cotton's son, correct?
Correct. This is Increase Mather. That's right.
Yes. Okay. Wow. Interesting names in the Mather family.
In Cases of Conscience, Increase Mather forcefully related his distrust of spectral evidence to convict witches. And this is a fairly famous line of logic now that lives to this day. He argued that it would be better that 10 witches go free than the blood of a single innocent witch be shed. Now, looking back on the Salem witchcraft trials, we can see all of the pitfalls that the founding fathers would then flip and become the foundational pillars of criminal protections in the United States Constitution. We're talking the fact that there was no legal right to representation, no presumption of innocence, the shoddy nature of warrants. Everything about the Salem witchcraft trials offends the notion of what we now know of the protections afforded to the accused in this country.
And I think that's a really good point, Bill. It shows just how far we came, and we talked about this in the freedom of religion extra credit, in that there's a lot of time, there's 100 years between the Salem witchcraft trials and the writing of the Constitution, almost exactly 100 years. So you can see just how far thinking came with regards to this and the impact that the Enlightenment had on the founding fathers. So let's pause just for a second and explain what eventually happened to these people who were arrested and mostly convicted of witchcraft. By the spring of 1692, over 100 people were arrested, including a 4-year-old named Dorcas Good. They had to make chains for her because her limbs were so tiny she could not fit into the chains. On June 2nd, 1692, this is the beginning of it all. The girls begin to freak out and are being controlled by the devil or being controlled by other witches, being controlled by other witches. Out of approximately the 200 accused, 55 confess, and we talked about the motivations for confession earlier. There's one unique case, a man named Giles Corey. He was not hung or died in prison, but instead he was pressed to death. He didn't want to legitimize these trials. So Giles Corey refused to make a plea, figuring if he didn't say he was guilty or not guilty, then they couldn't move forward with the trial. So they ended up laying a board on top of him and slowly putting more weight on him. And every time they asked for a plea, he just said, more weight. And of course, today, we would not see someone being pressed to death because of the Enlightenment ideals of the Founding Fathers who implemented the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which is what, Bill?
It's the constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment.
Very good. Good job, Bill. I put you right on the spot there. You hit it out of the park. So 5 were executed in July. More were executed in August of 1692. And I think we start to see cracks in all of this when Reverend George Burroughs was accused and convicted for being a wizard. And George Burroughs, look, we've talked about how there's pretty much no way to prove that you are innocent throughout all of this. But there was one way. Supposedly, there was one way to prove that you were innocent and you were not a witch or wizard. And what was that, Bill?
You could recite the Our Father.
All right, good job. Yes, you could recite the Our Father verbatim. And that's what George Burroughs did. Before they killed him, he recited the Our Father verbatim. And they probably looked around at each other and thought, well, crap, we're expecting this. And they killed him anyway, unfortunately. 24 people total died throughout this entire hysteria, whether they're being hung, pressed to death, or died in prison, which quite a few died in prison. When this came to an end, there were many, many more in prison, and the girls were traveling to other towns throughout present-day Massachusetts and into Connecticut, accusing other people they had never met before of being witches or wizards.
One point of order, they also killed 2 dogs who they accused of witchcraft.
That's just, I mean,
wow.
They killed 2 dogs. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. I'm glad you think that's unbelievable and not like the, death of 2 dogs.
I mean, the people dying too is bad. It's bad.
Okay, good. As long as we're on the same page. But, as these girls travel to other towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it begins to fall apart because they start accusing people of seemingly unimpeachable character. And of course, in my opinion, it all began with Reverend George Burroughs, a man of great character, reciting the Our Father and still being killed. The people of Salem eventually admitted that they were wrong throughout this entire witch hunt. Governor Phipps actually outlawed the use of spectral evidence. And of course, without that, it all falls apart. We've talked about how at least in our opinions, the spectral evidence really was the pillar of all of these convictions.
It's interesting to point out that while, yes, Chris, Governor Phipps did end the use of spectral evidence, his lieutenant actually thought he was too soft on those accused and pushed to have all those imprisoned on charges of witchcraft be executed. Of course, that does not happen. The trials come to an end in May of 1693 when Governor Phipps pardoned all those still imprisoned on witchcraft charges, thus ending the period known as the Salem Witchcraft Trials. What comes after this admittedly dark period? I'll tell you. A period,
Thank you. I'm glad you're going to answer your own question.
A period of atonement in the colony. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, issued a public confession of guilt and an official apology. Several of the jurors who served came forward to say they were sadly diluted and mistaken in their judgments. Reverend Samuel Parris even conceded errors of judgment. Our friend Governor Phipps, though, simply shifted the blame to his lieutenant, who admittedly did appear to be a lunatic. So we have this...
One additional note is Cotton Mather was his reputation was badly damaged by this. So later, when a outbreak of plague occurred in Boston, he was a proponent of inoculation, and people poo-pooed that idea because of his association with the Salem witch trial, even though he was right in this case.
So we have this group of people who were instrumental in the Salem witchcraft trials taking place, escalating, and continuing. And they all, some regretted their involvement and their role in the trials themselves. But what I did not list off were, what about the accusers? What did they do after this whole period of time? Well, what's interesting is that none of the accusers, sans one, actually acknowledged or apologized for what they started. The only
that's
one...
incredible.
It is. And listen to this. The only one who came forward was Ann Putnam. She accused 62 people of witchcraft. She came forward and issued an apology in 1706.
So she accused about 1/3 of all of the people, and she issued an apology 13 years later.
Yeah, it sure took some time.
Yeah, after some of them likely had passed away.
Yeah.
Thus, never hearing an apology from any of their accusers.
She was the only one of the accusers in our recorded history that would come forward and actually apologize.
Wow. That is a sobering reminder of just how big of a disaster this period in Salem, Massachusetts was. And as we, transition to wrap all of this up, I think it's once again important to reconsider, why did this all happen, right? This was the question I started the episode with. Why did this all happen? And the three of us will be the first to admit that there's no clear explanation or clear reason why this all happened. But there are definitely possible explanations given by many different historians to try to explain what happened here in Salem. So the first one I'll talk about is that there was a clear distinction at this time between Salem town and Salem village. Salem town was diversifying economically. In trade, they were far more economically successful, and there was a very clear socioeconomic rivalry being created between these two divergent neighborhoods in Salem. Well, most of the accusers were from the village, and the accused were mostly from Salem town. And we also have to remember that if you're accused and convicted of witchcraft, your land is taken from you and would be turned over to the government and then available for purchase. So there are long-lasting impacts for your family if you have your land taken from you. And this actually, when we think about Giles Corey and his refusal to enter a plea, this likely played a really big role for him. If he entered a plea, he would likely either be admitting to being a wizard or found guilty of it for refusing, and then his land would be taken from his family. And so he would, in essence, be damning his family in the future. In addition to this, there's a very clear rivalry between two early founding families, between the Putnams and the Porters. And the Porters were becoming more financially successful, and they were the ones being targeted throughout all of this, and it's believed the Putnams may have been behind it. There's actually there's a lot of depth to that story and rivalry that we don't have the time to get into, but you can look into it another time if you're interested. It's really it's some pretty good stuff. And you also have to keep in mind, Reverend Parris, he was an unpopular minister at this time. He was not getting paid properly, and he was very unhappy with his role. His daughter and niece are afflicted. They're involved in all of this. So he has incentive to look outside of his household because he's trying to protect his own reputation. So he doesn't want his daughter and his niece to be blamed for this or seen as witches. Thus, there must be witches who are, haunting them with their specter or controlling them in some way. So he's incentivized to believe them. Historians also claim that may have been an effort. This might be like a larger social movement to subordinate women, considering almost all of those accused were women. Zach brought up, and I've sort of talked about also, that there's political instability, especially on the frontier, with this fear of natives, and maybe they turn their fear within. Maybe these people in Salem Village recognized they could profit off of this by having the land, the more desirable land, which was more protected and, had more economic profitability, turned over to the government and made available. But in the end, no one's really certain what the motives were. But we do know that a couple dozen people were killed, hundreds were arrested, and the town of Salem, Massachusetts had to change its name because it was so embarrassed by this event that took place in 1692 and 1693. So, Zach, Bill, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion, and hopefully now you, the listener, can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Next week, in episode 18, we'll travel south for a little bit, covering Bacon's Rebellion, which happened right around the time of King Philip's War, and the curious case of indentured servitude in the American colonies. See you then.